So at this point, we're almost done with this app. And this was another long course module, but again, with many important new concepts and of course, a lot of chances to repeat concepts we learned about before. Now, the missing piece for this app here is of course the chart. And to build this chart here, I first of all want to go to my expense model and add a new class, a new data model to this file. And that will be the expense bucket class. Because for building this chart, we need multiple buckets, one for every category, so that we can sum up all the expenses that belong to one category and display them in the chart. So for that, I'm creating a separate class that will hold that summed up data. And this class here, which defines a group of expenses in the end, needs two main properties. It needs a category property, which is of type category, so which uses our own category enum type here. And in addition to that, I also want to have a list of expenses, because such a bucket, as mentioned, will include multiple expenses. That's the idea behind this class. Therefore, of course, we then can add our constructor expense bucket, where we set this category and this expenses, and both should also be required, like this. Now, in addition to setting up those properties to store all these expenses, I also want to add a getter to this class here, which will return a double value, so a number with decimal points. And I'll name this total expenses. And this is simply a utility getter, you could say, which I'm adding, which sums up all the expenses we have in here, so that we can conveniently get the total expenses from a bucket. And keep in mind, we'll have one bucket per category. Now, to build that sum, I'll create a helper variable, sum here, which starts at 0. And I want to return this sum in the end. But in between these steps, I want to sum up all the expenses. And this can be done with a for loop, though I'll use a new version of that for loop, a variant of that for loop, which we haven't seen before. Instead of creating a for loop where we create a helper variable I and we then keep on looping as long as I is smaller than expenses length, for example, and we increment I by 1 after every iteration, instead of doing that, which we could also do to get hold of the individual expenses, I'll use a variation of that for loop, which is perfect for going through all the elements in a list. You can use this syntax where you create a helper variable, which for every loop iteration is final because it will be recreated after every iteration. And here I'll create a helper variable expense, and then we can use the special in keyword to simply tell Dart that we want to go through all the items in this list, so in expenses. And in every iteration, a new item will be picked and will be stored in a newly created final variable called expense. And then, therefore, inside of that loop body, so between these curly braces, we have access to that single expense. And this simply is an alternative, which is perfect for going through the items in a list, since it is a bit shorter and maybe easier to understand than manually managing a helper variable I and using that as an index. Which you could, of course, also do, though. But here we can loop through all the expenses in our expenses list like this, and then simply add the expense amount to the sum by setting sum equal to sum plus expense dot amount. And this can actually be shortened and can instead be written like this, which is the equivalent to setting it like this. This is simply shorter and tells Dart that you want to set sum equal to sum plus the expense amount. And this is therefore how we can define such a getter that sums up all the expenses in this expense list and returns a total sum as a number. And we'll need this helper for the chart because in the chart, of course, the different bars for the different expense buckets, so for the different categories, should be displayed in relation to each other. And for that, of course, we need to know the total expense of every bucket so that we can adjust the chart bar heights.